Welcome everybody to our Data Hub session from Social Cybersecurity. I'm here to introduce today's speaker, but before that, a couple of announcements. First off, the Carnegie Mellon workshop in social cybersecurity is November 19th and 20th. You are able to currently join that, to register for, etc. If you have questions, please contact myself, Kathleen Carley at CMU in order to get additional information. But it will be focusing in on disinformation in times of crisis. There will be both a lot of panels, so you can just attend and join it, or there's still time to submit papers. If you're submitting a paper at this point, we just need a title and a short abstract. Anything up to 1,000 words. If you have something longer, feel free to send out. But we don't need, something shorter is perfectly good. So today our speaker is Cori Faklaris, and I butchered her name as usual.
No, it's fine.
So Cori has a really fabulous background. She actually has a communications journalism background in addition to a human-computer interaction background. And she brings these factors together to look at human factors in cybersecurity. Her research looks at trying to understand people's attitudes in the social context, as well as developing technologies to empower people to keep themselves and their networks secure. So with these are her two aims in the work that she does. Her current project is looking at applying social influence and gamification techniques to boost adoption of end user security tools and best practices. And she'll be talking a little bit more about that with us as we go along. So again, this is Cori Faklaris, and she'll be talking to us in our Data Hub. Cori, take it away.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Kathleen. And then Chris, are we recording?
Sorry, a little slow on the mute button there. Yes, we are recording. Thank you.
Okay, great. I just wanted to check. Hi. So yes, thank you so much for the great introduction, Kathleen. Yes, as she said, my name's Cori Faklaris. I'm a PhD student at Carnegie Mellon University. And so I'll just talk about some of my recent findings in these areas of end user cybersecurity attitudes and behaviors. I just want to note and thank the people that support me, the National Science Foundation. I'm also part of the Human Computer Interaction Institute's Social Cybersecurity Lab. And then I'm also funded by Scilab and of course by the CMU Ideas Center, where I'm a Knight Fellow this year. So now I need to click, okay. So the major takeaways from this talk will be three things. First of all, I'm going to talk about something specific about cybersecurity that is called unintentional insider threat. And so this kind of threat can arise because our security tools or infrastructure does not really adequately account, especially for our social needs. And so that's a focus of our HCII Social Cybersecurity Project. The second thing is just noting people are more likely to turn to trusted peers, but not to experts, such as their IT departments, for help in navigating cybersecurity obstacles. And so one of our recent studies really brought that home to us. And third, we have developed several lightweight and flexible measures of security attitude that can help organizations to identify which of these peers in the workplace are most in need of cybersecurity awareness training or say security behavior nudges. And so I'll talk about all of these things more in this talk. And so yes, just to reiterate, this is my background. I have had a really interesting resume that I'm a fourth year PhD. I have actually a master's degree now, also in human computer interaction, and hope to be on the job market next fall. So I just started just putting out the word early. But also I spent my industry career in news and design, mostly at the Indianapolis Star and some related properties for Gannett. And I like to joke, no matter what my actual title was, I had several throughout my career. I always was the doer of things no one else wants to do. But that happily led me to social media. And so I've also spent a lot of time in my career as a social media editor and consultant. And so, yes, in my research at Carnegie Mellon, I am very focused on the human factors of cybersecurity. And so that's in two parallel tracks, one in understanding people and their needs, and the other, I want to empower people to be an active partner in cybersecurity defense, and also just keeping our online spaces secure and private. And to do that, I examine not only people's individual differences, but also think about how, as social animals, we humans construct our understandings of the world socially, either through interaction with each other or through our social contexts of use. And so my work so far has fallen into three major buckets. So the first would be empirical or observational, where I've done work on romantic cybersecurity. So thinking about couples, if you have a romantic partner, households, you have a lot of shared cybersecurity needs and pain points. And then also today, I'll talk a little bit about work group cybersecurity, where we've done survey work and interviews. I'm also really excited about some of the theoretical and modeling work that I've done, which I'll also talk about today. And then I've also done some technical and design work, such as creating simple social nudges. We've developed a plugin called SOCCYBSEC that sits over the top and can help you navigate your Facebook privacy settings, for instance. We've developed a game called Apps versus Hackers that's a takeoff on the Plants versus Zombies popular online game. And then also we've done work to create social authentication tools. So today I'll talk more in depth about two of these studies that I'm thinking about building my thesis on. So human factors, to me, this is such a critical area for research in cybersecurity, partly because we've seen a really dramatic increase in so-called social engineering attacks. And so, for instance, in the 5-year period before 2018, Verizon noted that the number of cybersecurity breaches where the attackers used so-called social methods increased from 17% to 35%. And the involvement of human assets, such as employees, in these breaches rose from 19% to 39% in the same period. And so that leads me to this idea of the UIT, or unintentional insider threat. So this is a legitimate user in your system who accidentally, not maliciously, jeopardizes security through leaks or errors. And so this is a term that was first developed by our colleagues at the Software Engineering Institute here in Pittsburgh. So they examined this idea that sometimes the problems in your security network are not coming because you have somebody who's malicious or intending to leak things, somebody who the attacker is just targeting because they know it's a lot easier to trick an end user into letting them into the system than trying to get in through sometimes the very good, very elaborate technical cybersecurity defenses, or trying to trick system administrators, people that have more expertise. But the happy thing is that we've also created a lot of good defenses that end users can employ to help keep themselves and their network safe. And so some of these are, say, multi-factor authentication schemes, such as when you get a push on your phone that supplements your password. Also, just the method of keeping your software up to date. We've gotten better as usable security experts at trying to time software update notices, not always, of course, but to try to not interrupt people too much, but also gently nudge them to install those security fixes right away. It's also, of course, super important that people are alert for scams and hoaxes, whether that's phishing emails or false news spread on social media. And then finally, all of us, me included, sometimes fail to use long and unique passwords, but that's also a really important point. So my work builds on some key related work in usability in cybersecurity that I want to mention. So first is this idea that these humans in the loop really are our key partners in cybersecurity. And users are, in my view, trainable, and you can create new and better tools for them to help you keep the network safe. And so one key paper was Sassy, Brostoff, and Weinrich, where they described transforming the so-called weakest link, that would be humans, through usable and effective security. And the other idea that's really important for our lab is how important it is to think about social psychology when we look at people's security behaviors. And so a previous student, Shavik Das, who's now a professor at Georgia Tech, has talked about in his work the effect that social influence has on people's so-called security sensitivity, which is their awareness, motivation, and knowledge of how to engage in these methods, such as two-factor authentication. Some people have also tried to create some simple measures of end-user compliance. And so a key one, the state-of-the-art before I started my PhD, was called SOCCYBS. That stands for Security Behavior Intention Scale. And then finally, we've seen just a blossoming of research in end-user social computing, trying to get a handle on this as a site of information warfare and think about what can we do to counteract this. And so Kathleen Carley, David Beskow have this wonderful paper about social cybersecurity really now being an emerging national security requirement. And so today I'm going to talk briefly about two recent studies and also a future work that I've been engaged in to address this unintentional insider threat issue. And so the first one I'll talk about is this work group cybersecurity interview study that we've done this year. And so this work follows up on some two online survey studies that we did in the last couple of years, one with 98 people, the second with 288 people. And for these surveys, we put them on crowdsourcing sites that are popular with researchers, such as Amazon Mechanical Turk and Prolific Academic. And so for these surveys, we define this concept of account and device sharing. That is when more than one person uses the same username and password to access a work resource. And so usually systems are not designed to have more than one person use this username and password, but we already know from other work that people often will do this when they're in a work group situation and they see this as necessary to get their work done. And so indeed, in this survey though, we were able to document widespread account sharing by people on these sites who were employees at other companies as well. And they reported sharing accounts and devices for two basic reasons. One, to collaborate with each other, and then also to lower costs. And so they said, you know, from this surveys, we documented these workarounds, such as account and device sharing, are actually the norm in these workspaces. You can think about something as simple as passwords taped to a PC monitor, which you may or may not have in your in-person workspaces right now. But also, you know, when you have to resort to these workarounds, it makes it really difficult to share access, to control access, because you're really kind of fighting the system and how it was built. And then among the people involved, there's just a real lack of accountability and awareness of activities. And so this year we did an interview study to gain some deeper insights into this, maybe to create some more actionable recommendations. And so we had 3 research questions. I'll focus on 2 of them today. The first one being, we just wanted to focus in on our own university because it was the easiest way to get this study done during COVID-19 constraints. And so what kinds of accounts are being shared in this setting? And then what is motivating the sharing among different types of workers? And then the other question I'll address today is, you know, thinking how is cybersecurity and collaboration impacted by this widespread shift we've all been living to remote work? And so we were really pleasantly surprised to find, at least at our university, when people do share, and they do share a lot, they do it relatively safely. And so we found that 74% of our participants did report sharing accounts. Now, some of them are using a device called an enterprise random password manager. And so this would be the people who are involved in information security, specifically, or other types of IT tasks. And so this is a great commercial product that actually functions like your individual password manager might, but helps an organization to create really strong, secure passwords that are hard to break, but then also you're able to share these accounts and share these passwords through the password manager. And so that was a really nice thing to see. Individuals also reported using a commercial password manager designed simply for themselves or for their families. And that's also really great to see. I highly recommend that for everybody who's listening to this. Other people used ad hoc methods. You know, I mentioned before the sticky note attached to the monitor. Other people said, you know, we're using plain text messages that we're storing in a group chat, say on WhatsApp or something like that. And so that's less secure because if those accounts get hacked, somebody would have access to those plain text messages with passwords. And so we see here, this might be suggest an opportunity, say for a security nudge, maybe when a copy paste action is initiated on a username or password form field, just saying, you know, like, hey, just let you know, remember if you're pasting this somewhere, put it in something that's encrypted or otherwise, say, make sure it's going to a password manager and not to a plain text file. And we were, of course, though, really happy to see that our own cybersecurity awareness training seems to be going well because no one reported sharing the password link to their university username, which is usually the master key that gets you into a lot of things if you're a university member. And so I would also point out a couple other results that I think are interesting. And so we've seen this before that users see really little downside to circumventing cybersecurity mechanisms such as the one account, one user design. And so from their perspective, they have some constraints they really need to get around in order to get their work done. So for instance, say you've got two-factor authentication on an account, but it's tied to the mobile phone of a team member, and now they're not near you because you're working away from the lab. Or even if it was before COVID, they said, you know, people leave work and maybe you're working, you need to get into a resource, you need them to send that two-factor push to get you into the resource. The other thing that our community grapples with is they need to accommodate undergraduate turnover and vacations around school breaks. And so you know that you're going to have people frequently coming and going. So you maybe don't trust them as much to share things on their individual accounts. You're afraid that they're not going to transfer those assets back to you. You want them to use an account that's linked to the lab where you're all sharing access. And then finally, some people mentioned that they needed to share accounts to abide by university budget restrictions and policies. And so I'm sure that you can appreciate sometimes there's a little bit of a red tape issue in getting new spending, new billing, new subscriptions started. And so people just circumvent that by sharing accounts that already exist. But the other thing we found that was really cool was evidence that, you know, people are sharing accounts, they said, because they trust each other. In fact, somebody from IT remarked, I'm not sure that they should trust each other that much, or they shouldn't trust me, but people all will just right out of the blue tell me their password if they need me to help with something. And so I actually think that's kind of speaks well of our community too. Maybe even we could consider account sharing as maybe a negative predictor of intentional insider threat, thinking that if you have a trusting organizational culture where morale is pretty good, at least at the time of this sample, you know, you're less likely to create, you know, an intentional insider threat, somebody like an Edward Snowden, say, who's gonna go rogue, try to leak things intentionally. And finally, I would say that we did find that work from home employees overwhelmingly were turning to their peers and not to IT for help. And so, you know, I think this is not a good thing, that the lack of proximity to each other has hurt information flows and informal contacts. And so, you know, I spoke earlier about, you know, one participant saying they were storing passwords now in plain text messages and group chat. When we send things via electronic communication, but we're not speaking them, Yeah, I think even if you had written notes in private spaces protected by locks, to me that seems more secure sometimes than an electronic networked resource that could be hacked. And the other thing we definitely found evidence of was so-called shadow security. So that's when a work group, say, kind of takes it upon themselves to be their own IT department. And you have somebody who's not part of the official IT organization, who's helping really to manage accounts and devices and to troubleshoot issues without their knowledge. And so, you know, the issue is, I think maybe they don't always know what the policy should be, or they're not doing following some procedures that maybe IT has in place for good reasons. So we see an opportunity here to designate, say, so-called security buddies. And so we know people are turning to their peers in work groups now, especially in the work from home situation. So maybe just lean into that, have a security buddy assigned from IT for the work group, maybe vice versa. They could be liaisons for transmitting best practices as we go through the situation and try to head off problems. So now I'm going to turn to the second recent study that I've been working on. And so now instead of documenting people's behaviors, I'm examining a survey data set that I collected in 2018 with 209 online responses, where we've been developing several scales to measure security attitude. And so this follows on some previous work that was published in 2019, where I created the so-called SA6, 6-item security attitude scale. And so this is specifically meant to measure this idea of security sensitivity that was documented in Shavak Das's work and the work of other people in usable security. And so it's these 6 items that we found has very desirable psychometric properties, very reliable. We've also found strong indications of the psychometric value of it through tests of validity. But you know, it's 6 items, which is really short compared to some other scales. But I still heard some complaints from some researchers. They would say, well, what if I only used a couple of the items? Is that possible? And I'd say, well, we didn't validate it for a couple items. We validated it for 6. So I'm not sure I can recommend that. But I have some sympathy for researchers in these situations. You know, so that led to the first research question. Say you did have a very long survey, you only with other measures in it, can we shorten SA6 and still retain its desirable psychometric properties? And so specifically, for instance, if you're testing something regarding the theory of reasoned action here, this theory basically sets forth that attitude, intention, and behavior are interrelated. And so maybe you also are using CBSEC to measure intention, and you also have a measure for behavior. It would be really nice if all of these were as short as possible. But the other question this also prompted was, I wonder then also, can we enhance SA6 with some measures of different aspects of attitude? So thinking specifically, say I want to persuade people to engage in specific security behaviors. I want to follow maybe a persuasion model that might have a factor such as hesitation to act or desire to change behavior as intermediate stages before we even form an intention to engage in that behavior. And so to answer the first research question, yes, we did find that if we shorten SA6 just to this engagement scale of just 3 items, we can still preserve many of the desirable psychometric properties of the 6-item scale. And so those 3 items would be generally, I diligently follow a routine about security practices. I'm often interested in articles about security threats, and I seek out opportunities to learn about security measures that are relevant to me. And so these items, all of them would be rated on a bidirectional scale, 1 being strongly disagree to 5 strongly agree. And then the other 3 items also sort nicely into another scale called attentiveness. And so, you know, this named after the lead item here, I always pay attention to experts' advice about the steps I need to take. And that would also include measures such as I'm extremely knowledgeable about all the steps needed to keep my online data account safe. And then I'm extremely motivated to take all of these steps that are drawn specifically from Shavik Dawes' work about the influence of social influences on security sensitivity. So now I'm going to expand the scale to answer research question 2 with an additional 7 items to create something new called SA13. And so this adds 2 more scales. So 4 items will form a resistance scale. And so those items would be items such as, I will not use security measures if they are inconvenient. There are good reasons why I do not take the necessary steps to keep my online data account safe. I am too busy to put in the effort needed. And also, I have much bigger problems than my risk of a security breach. And so this scale performed very, very well and displayed very, very good psychometric properties in the tests that I've run so far. You know, I think there are lots of times in my work and maybe in yours where I know that I might be researching a problem where I would like to know, you know, regardless of whether somebody is actually engaging in security behavior, how do they feel about it? Are they resisting it? Because that could create problems down the road, or maybe indicate that we need to redesign some of the tools that are causing them issues. And then finally, the last 3 items for SA13 sort of rounded out with this concernedness scale. And so this would be for the stage in between, say, resistance or maybe wholehearted acceptance of security measures, where maybe you want to change your security behaviors, or even you worry that you're not doing enough. And so this is probably the scale that is performing less well in my tests. But when it's all combined into a composite, SA13 as a whole also performs very, very well and has a lot of desirable psychometric properties. And so we have a handout at our website, socialcybersecurity.org, for SA13 if you want to download it and use that. But of course, this has not been published yet. You're also simply welcome to use the SA6 scale that was published at the Symposium on Usable Privacy and Security in 2019. And then here's just some additional details about some of the relationships that I found when I crunched the numbers in this data set for SA13. And so on the one side, you see the average scores for the 4 separate scales. And then you would reverse the scores for the resistance items to compute the overall SA13 score. And then on the other side, I started modeling some of these variables in the data set. I can use methods such as structural equation modeling to examine the directed relationships, where maybe we can try to see what certain measures maybe would cause or show significant positive associations and actually account for significant variances in other measures in the study. And so here you see SA13 security attitudes are in the center of the diagram. And then there's an arrow pointing to another measure we've got in the data set of security behaviors, which was technically called the Recalled Security Action Scale that I also published in 2019 at SOCCYBSEC. And so using this measure as a proxy for security behavior, SA13 is accounting for 30% of the variance in that security behavior scale. So that's a really nice indication that SA13 could be used to measure attitudes, and also that that's somewhat strongly predictive of whether that can be used to indicate somebody you know, in the process of changing their behavior or receptive to changing their behavior. So how to use the security attitude scales. There's a couple different reasons I can think of why I wanted these scales, and you might too. I want to answer practical research questions, for instance, such as how attentive to security advice is a certain group likely to be. Also, say you created a new awareness campaign or usability tool. Does it help or hurt the overall attitudes towards expert advice or other security measures? And especially at scale, it's nice to have something that can simply be deployed in a survey as opposed to having to interview people, which, as much as I love talking to people as a former journalist, it involves quite a bit of time and resources to do that and to crunch that data. And then, of course, for academics specifically, sometimes we do really need to measure cognitive factors in our theory-motivated research. And so I tend to base a lot of my work in the theory of reasoned action. So I'd love to have this great set of tools for measuring attitude. There are related models, such as the technology acceptance model, that are in use in HCI. But also, if you might want a proxy for motivation, there are some items in here I think indicate it could be used to measure motivation, possibly even to measure coping appraisal in protection motivation theory, which I know is very, very highly used in cybersecurity. So now I'm going to turn from that work to the last item that I'm looking at, which is a smartphone alertness experimental study. And so this one I'm still designing, but I just wanted to give you a brief overview, especially if you have any thoughts about this or any feedback. And so, one thing I started thinking about, going back to the statistics from Verizon that I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, was the time frame in which we saw the number of cybersecurity breaches due to social engineering jumping. And so this time frame from 2013 to 2018 coincides with a huge rise in the adoption of smartphones, specifically worldwide. And so in this Verizon report, also talking with a couple other people, start wondering, do smartphones, are they affecting alertness to misinformation, for instance, such as phishing or false news? And so I was happy to be awarded an Idea Center Knight Fellowship to design an experiment for this fall. And so there's a couple of different ideas I want to test in this experiment. So first of all, I'm really intrigued by this idea that maybe in psychology, I've seen some literature that weight as a physical factor can also cognitively transfer to weight as a metaphor. And so I want to just see, like, if I weighted devices differently, can I replicate a study for this condition where, say, you expose people to different types of real news and false news? Are they more likely, less likely, no change to accurately judge which is true and which is false, depending on the form factor of the device that they're looking at? Because we've seen a lot of studies about what's actually on the screen when people are trying to judge information, but not so much. We haven't really seen whether the actual form factor of the computing device affects that. But there's an alternate explanation I'd also like to follow up on. So when we have a smartphone, oftentimes we're not just focusing on what's right in front of us on the screen. We're probably multitasking. And so say you're more likely to be in a context where you're cognitively overloaded, such as you're walking, people are talking to you, you're thinking about a lot of things apart from, say, the email that just popped up. Maybe you're shopping, you're trying to judge prices or qualities, and then you're also scanning your Facebook. So this is another explanation I will also want to test in this experiment. If we create situations, different types of conditions, say with no cognitive overload and then some and a lot, does that also affect people? How does that interact with the weight factor, what kind of device they're using in terms of their alertness to misinformation? So just to recap the major takeaways from this talk, unintentional insider threat can arise because security tools or infrastructure does not account for social needs. People are more likely to turn to their trusted peers and not to experts for help in navigating cybersecurity obstacles. And then finally, we've developed several lightweight, flexible measures of security attitude that can help organizations identify who's most in need of training or perhaps some security nudges. So thank you so much for your attention today and the opportunity to talk to you about my work. I'm happy to answer questions or listen to your comments.
Yeah, Cori, very interesting. And I have a question. So have you thought about how to intervene? Like it seems like the picture you painted, like it's very difficult to handle. What can we do? Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, interventions definitely. That's one thing I've definitely been thinking about as well. So for instance, you know, I think there are some simple social nudges that I've outlined before that we could test more of. For instance, say looking at social influence theory from Cialdini. So there, he outlined 6 so-called weapons of influence. So thinking about, say, this influence of liking. So that actually goes back to the security buddy idea. Say, you know that there's somebody who's popular in a work group. If you give them, target the training to them, or you create the security buddy out of them, if somebody is liked, people are more likely to be influenced by them. So that could be a very simple kind of intervention. Excuse me. But also thinking about, what if we create some over the top, you know, kinds of devices. So we have created this plugin called SOCCYBSEC. And so that would be something that you could just have as a Chrome plugin, very simple intervention. And so when you create a new tab on your Google Chrome browser, it's going to prompt you with a very quick question, just to review a couple of your Facebook privacy and security settings. And then it will also show you, say, some social context, say survey results, or also what your friends and family have as the setting. And so these can be really, really good interventions. But I have to say, for you know, end users in general, but I have to say, I think one thing I would like to do with my thesis is to think about how can I build on this work group cybersecurity idea, and think about, well, what are some interventions that organizations would really benefit from that they don't already have in place? Because I think, you know, we've already got, for instance, some really good you know, types of training available for cybersecurity awareness, but say it's really expensive. And also just anecdotally talking to people who go through this kind of training, sometimes they're not really listening. Maybe they feel almost insulted by it, like, well, of course I know all this stuff already. So it'd be interesting to think about, are there differences between people or between social groups, or we should target different types of interventions to them.
Thank you. So Cialdini's book is still the classic in terms of influence.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of it. Even though, like a lot of psychology work, sometimes I think to myself, well, I wonder if there's a novelty effect at play, not just that there's an actual mechanism that works, but you know, I think we're starting to explore, are some of these ideas replicable, and can we create enough of a sample size so if they have a small effect, we can still see if there is an effect.
Yeah, Cialdini is an emeritus professor at ASU, Arizona State University.
Yeah, do you know him at all?
We just met like a few times at some university level gatherings, that's all. I think because he is an emeritus professor, right? He does not come. But yeah, he is a very famous guy on campus too.
Oh, I can, I can imagine. And too, yes.
The nudging technologies, are they actually incorporated in being part of tools, you know, transition to them?
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't quite catch that, Kathleen.
So for the nudging technologies that you've been working on, have any of them been picked up by a company and are now part of a tool, or?
No, actually, I had been in talks with a company right before COVID hit, but then we ceased talking about it at that point.
Okay.
I have had a couple companies reach out to me this fall to try to make contacts, and so we'll see what develops with that. But yeah, so I think for me, I'll be most interested to see if these get deployed at a larger scale than we can deploy in the lab, because partly because I do think that sometimes the effect of social influence and nudges is small enough that you're not going to get a significant difference with a really small sample, such as you would get in person. Second of all, of course, because it's really difficult to do in-person studies now. But if it's something that we can deploy remotely, we can get a lot of scale, but then also work within the constraints of this moment. And then, of course, lastly, I would just like to see some of the things that we develop actually make it to the outside academia market, so that we can help people.
Do you have another question in the group? So I have another question for you that I got an email from asking, to what extent would these ideas apply to things other than passwords, such as secure phone numbers or other kind of potentially shareable but individual IDs?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think there is some applicability, because anytime that we have any kind of digital identity signature that people are sharing like that, that is a potential for, say, either it being exposed in either in insecure transit, or because wherever it's stored is breached, but also potentially because of like a so-called cross-site attack. So say like my threat model, for instance, for some data such as my shopping list is, have at it. Russia, come get my Target, or Amazon wish list, who cares? Send me stuff, please. But the problem is, say that, that insecure data is stored using some sort of digital ID, such as a password, but it could also be other types of identifiers that I'm also sharing with some other account that I do care about, such as my investment accounts. And so that's when we have a big problem, because then if that insecure site with my low risk data is breached, they could also get into my other account if they start just trying credentials one by one. They might hit on the one that I've actually reused. Yeah, so it's a really interesting point. So as we move, say, beyond passwords to other forms of authenticating people, the basic principles are still going to be there, but we'll know that people will want to cut corners and save time wherever they can. And then how do we help them not create more problems?
And another question is, I'm not sure what they're saying here. Oh, I think it boils down to, won't biometrics just simply solve this?
Oh, biometrics, yeah. Well, that's a really interesting area, right? Because you would think that would be something that nobody could fake, but I don't know that that's really true. Like if I have a fingerprint, it gets me in, that is my two-factor for my iPhone. Say, there is a password that it stores, and then it just requires me as the second factor to input my fingerprint. But it's being turned into ones and zeros. And anything that, even though my fingerprint in theory is mine and mine alone, the fact is this is a file that could probably be spoofed or hacked. And the real problem with biometrics is I can't change my fingerprint like I can change my password if it's hacked. So I actually worry more about biometrics. I actually think maybe the the threat surface is different, but actually the consequences of a breach are much more significant. You know, because unless we're all going to be starting to do plastic surgery if these files get hacked.
Do you have another question from the group? Well, I think that concludes us for today. Again, everyone, don't forget that one of our next events is the conference on November 19th and 20th. I forgot to announce that there will also be a day of tutorials associated with that, which will be on November 18th. And if you're interested, send me email. And the cost for the tutorials are completely free. They're sponsored under the Knight Foundation, and they will be covering various things in the area of social cybersecurity. Again, we hope that you will send papers to present, and to send me again title, an abstract, and so on. There will be publications coming out of that. There's a special issue of the journal, and if there's enough good papers, we've also got a contract for a book that could come out of that as well. So I hope you will join us there and in November. Cori, thank you very, very much. And everybody, I'll see you again next month.
Thank you, everybody. It's good to see everybody. Take care.